At a billionaire's rehearsal dinner, the quiet maid was supposed to stay invisible. But when the bride humiliated her in front of everyone, mocked her, insulted her, and ordered her to get on her knees, something in the room changed. The guests felt it. The staff noticed it. Even the groom's uncle went pale. Because the woman standing there with a silver decanter was not reacting like someone who was weak. She was reacting like someone who was holding back. And before that dinner was over, everyone in that room would realize they had made a terrible mistake. The estate sat on 12 private acres outside Boston, 4 stories of hand-cut limestone and black iron windows facing the harbor. Its hallways were lined with original artwork. Its wine cellar was temperature-controlled to a single degree. Its chef had once cooked for a president. And on this particular Thursday evening, every single one of its 28 dining chairs was filled with someone whose net worth could fund a small country's election. The rehearsal dinner had been planned for 4 months. Isabelle Laurent, 28, a French-born socialite whose family owned 3 vineyards and a string of hotels across Europe, had insisted on a 9-course tasting menu, a sommelier flown in from Burgundy, and a guest list curated down to the last ambassador. She had chosen the candles herself. She had chosen the menu cards herself. She had chosen the seating chart herself. She had chosen, in fact, every detail of the evening, except the one variable she had never once considered important: the woman who would refill her glass. The Ashworth estate had been built in 1903 by a railroad baron whose name still appeared on 3 buildings downtown. The mansion had survived the 1962 fire, a hostile takeover attempt in 1987, and a decade of quiet renovations. It had hosted 2 presidents, 4 foreign dignitaries, and at least 1 spy whose identity remained classified in 3 different countries. On this Thursday evening, it was hosting something far more dangerous than any of those. A woman in a charcoal uniform who had not said her real name aloud in 5 years, working a room full of people who had never once asked what her name was. Amara had worked as the senior housekeeper of the Ashworth estate for 14 months. 34 years old, 5'9", hair pulled back in a low knot. Charcoal uniform during the day, deep navy in the evening. She had a measured voice. She had steady hands. She had a smile that reached exactly as high as her eyes, and not 1 inch further. Because she had trained herself a long time ago that showing too much of anything was a kind of vulnerability she could not afford. In her former life, a smile had once bought her 3 extra seconds in a stairwell in Lagos. In her former life, a smile had once almost cost her everything in a hotel in Bogota. The difference between those 2 smiles had been a single blink. She moved through the dining room the way smoke moves through a closed window. Present, silent, impossible to detect until you tried to find her. The other staff called her the shadow when they thought she could not hear. They were not wrong. Amara had spent 11 years learning how to enter a room before anyone noticed the door had opened. How to pour a glass of water without disturbing the surface. How to read the rhythm of a conversation through a wall without ever needing to press her ear against it. These were not housekeeping skills. These were the skills of someone who had spent 11 years as the most sought-after close protection operative in 3 different time zones. The man of the house was Daniel Ashworth, 36, heir to a logistics empire his grandfather had built from a single delivery truck. Daniel was quiet. Daniel was patient. Daniel remembered every staff member's name on the first day they started, and he remembered them again on every anniversary after that. Sometimes, late at night, when the estate was empty except for the two of them, he wandered down to the kitchen and talked to her about his late father, about the weight of inheriting a company he had never wanted, about the strange loneliness of being constantly surrounded by people who only saw him for what he could give them. Daniel was the kind of man who heard the things people did not say, and Amara was the kind of woman who had learned, through years of watching rooms, to speak only when silence would cost more. Daniel's fiancée, Isabel, was everything Amara was not. Isabel was loud. Isabel was a brand before she was a person. Isabel wore jewelry that cost more than Amara's last 3 annual salaries combined. Isabel spoke about foundation galas she had not attended, reposted vacation photos with the caption, "The most magical week," and summoned her staff with a single raised finger. The kind of gesture Amara recognized from a very different kind of room. A room where that finger had once meant something entirely else. Isabel had grown up in a household where staff were expected to be invisible, where servers were furniture, where the woman who poured your wine was not a person but a function, a small machine whose purpose was to anticipate, serve, and disappear. Isabel had been beautiful in the way that wealth makes people beautiful, polished, expensive, immaculate, and cold underneath the surface in a way that came from never having been told, even once, that the people around her mattered. Also present that evening were 2 people whose presence Amara had noticed the moment she had walked into the dining room at 6 o'clock. The first was Robert Ashworth, Daniel's uncle, 61, a retired military intelligence officer who had spent 30 years in places that did not appear on any map. Robert had been watching Amara all evening from the far end of the table. He had not said a word, but his eyes had not left her once. The second was Dr. Lina Mwangi, a Kenyan-born neurosurgeon who had been invited as Daniel's personal guest, not because he knew her well, but because she had once, in a hospital corridor in Nairobi, performed a 4-hour emergency surgery on a man the government had told everyone had died. Dr. Mwangi had been quiet all evening. She had been watching Amara's hands. Robert Ashworth had recognized Amara the moment she had walked into the dining room. 21 years ago, in a basement safe house in Tunis, Amara had been 23 years old and Robert had been 40. And both of them had been extracting a defector whose handlers had been 3 steps behind them. Amara had made a choice that night. A single choice, made in 7 seconds, that had decided whether Robert lived or died. Robert had not forgotten. He had been waiting for 21 years for a chance to pay her back. The job at the estate had not been charity. It had been a debt. Dr. Mwangi had recognized Amara for an entirely different reason. Dr. Mwangi had spent 15 years working in field hospitals where the most dangerous patients were not the ones bleeding on the table. They were the ones who walked in perfectly healthy and asked questions about the security layout. Dr. Mwangi had last seen Amara's face on a photograph in a file she had been told to memorize and then destroy. The photograph had been labeled with a single word: asset. Dr. Mwangi had assumed Amara was dead. She had been wrong. The conflict began, as it always did, with a single raised finger. Isabel waved Amara over to the wine table, not with a hand gesture, with one finger raised slightly off the arm of her chair. Amara approached. Isabel did not look at her. Isabel looked at the wine list, then at Amara's hands, then at the wine list again.
"This is not the Chateau Margaux I requested," Isabel said, her voice pitched to carry to the entire table.
"Amara, darling, did you perhaps confuse the vintages?" Amara explained quietly that the wine was exactly what had been ordered. Isabel did not listen.
Isabel raised a hand, palm out, a small, dismissive gesture that meant, "Stop talking." Then Isabel called her over again. The water was too cold. The bread was sliced too unevenly. Amara was lurking, a word Isabel had used 4 times in the last 90 minutes, each time slightly louder than the last, each time designed to remind everyone at the table exactly who was visible and who was not. By the 7th course, something in the room had begun to break. Conversations grew quieter. Glasses stayed full. Eyes drifted toward the corner where Amara stood. A venture capitalist in the 4th seat leaned toward his wife and whispered, "Something is going to happen tonight." His wife had not believed him. By the end of the dinner, she would not forget what he had said. A retired judge in the 9th seat had also noticed. She had spent 40 years on the bench, and she had learned to read rooms the way sailors read weather, by the small signs most people missed. She could feel, the way one feels pressure drop before a storm, that something inside Amara was shifting. She did not know what. She only knew that the woman in the charcoal uniform was not the same woman who had poured the first glass of water 3 hours ago. And then Isabel did the thing that would change everything. She turned mid-sentence, mid-laugh, mid-story about a charity auction she had helped organize and had not actually attended, and looked at Amara, who was standing 4 feet behind her, holding a silver decanter with both hands. And she said, in a voice that carried to every corner of the room, "Amara, sweetheart, why don't you go back to your own country for a while? I'm sure they could use the help more than we can." The room went silent. 28 forks stopped mid-air. Daniel went still. The venture capitalist closed his eyes. He had heard this kind of cruelty before. He had never heard it land in a room full of people who all knew it was wrong. But across the table, Robert Ashworth's wine glass paused halfway to his lips. He set it down slowly. He looked at Amara's hands. He looked at the small, faded scar on the inside of her left wrist, the one she always kept covered by her sleeve. Robert had seen that scar before. He had seen it on a report, in a classified file, in a building that did not officially exist. "That face," Robert whispered to Dr. Mwangi, leaning so close his words would not carry. "It cannot be her." And then, as if she had heard him across 30 feet of polished wood and crystal, Amara turned her wrist slightly. Not enough for the guests to notice, but enough for Robert and Dr. Mwangi to see the second scar underneath. The one shaped like a small crescent. The one that only 6 operatives in the world carried. Dr. Mwangi's hand reached, very slowly, for the small silver pin she wore on her lapel. She pressed it once, a signal she had not used in 19 years. The signal meant, "Initiate contact protocol. Tell them the asset is present. Do not approach. Wait for confirmation." At the edge of the room, one of the security guards, a young man who had been told, before the dinner began, that his primary responsibility tonight was crowd control, looked at Amara, then at his supervisor, then at Amara again. The supervisor had been given a single instruction in a phone call 2 hours earlier from a voice he had never heard before. If the woman in the charcoal uniform moves faster than anyone else in the room, do not interfere. Do not approach. Call this number. Amara stayed calm. Amara stayed quiet. She refilled the water. She replaced the bread. She did not react. She had not reacted in 5 years. She had made a promise, on a cold afternoon on a rooftop in Casablanca in 2021, that she would never again use her hands for harm. And she had kept that promise. But Isabel, fueled by champagne and the reflected glow of 28 admiring faces, did not stop. She crossed the dining room. She stopped in front of Amara. She pointed at a small splash of red wine on the marble floor, a splash Amara had already cleaned twice, and said, loudly, for the entire room to hear, "Clean it. Now. On your knees. The way your people have always done it." The room watched. Isabel waited. Amara looked at the floor. And then, for the first time in 5 years, Amara looked up. Her eyes were not angry. They were not hurt. They were the kind of still that comes before earthquakes, before hurricanes, before the kind of silence that happens in a room when every single person realizes, at the same instant, that the next 10 seconds will change the shape of their lives. Everyone noticed. The venture capitalist's wife stopped breathing. The retired judge put down her fork. The chef in the corner took a small step back. The 2 other members of the household staff, who had been standing quietly along the wall, looked at each other with an expression that said, "Something is about to happen." But before anyone could speak, before Amara could respond, before Isabel could say another word, the side entrance of the estate exploded inward. 5 armed men, masked, silent, moving in a formation only professionals use, poured into the corridor. Their weapons were already raised. Their movements were already calm. They had been planning this for 6 weeks. They had been told that the estate's security team was 4 guards and 2 cameras. They had been told the only high-value person inside was Daniel Ashworth. They had been told the woman in the charcoal uniform was just a housekeeper. They had been told wrong. The men had been hired by a former competitor of the Ashworth Shipping Company, who had lost a $200 million contract 8 years ago and had been waiting, patiently, for the right moment to settle the score. The competitor had paid for blueprints of the estate's layout, schedules of tonight's staff, and a 5-man tactical team that had done similar work in 2 other countries. The team had been told that the only person in the building who might give them trouble was Daniel himself, and that Daniel was 40 pounds overweight and had not thrown a punch since college. The team had not been told about the housekeeper. Panic erupted. Glasses shattered. Guests dove beneath the table. Daniel pushed Isabel behind a marble column. Robert reached for a weapon he had not carried in 22 years and found, to his own surprise, that his hands remembered where it used to sit. The venture capitalist in the 4th seat did not move. He had seen enough corporate collapses to know that the next 12 seconds would define everything that happened after. The first armed man reached the dining room threshold. He raised his weapon. He did not get the chance to use it. Amara moved. Not fast, not dramatically. She moved the way water moves around a stone in a river. Without pause, without sound, without ever breaking the surface. In the space of 5 seconds, she had crossed the dining room, disarmed the first man without ever touching his weapon, redirected his momentum into the wall, and taken his sidearm in a motion that looked, to the watching guests, as if she had simply asked him for it. The second man fired. The bullet hit the chandelier above the table. Amara was no longer where the bullet had been aimed. She was behind him. She used his own radio strap to take him to the floor in a single movement that made no sound except the soft thud of his body against the marble. The third man turned. The fourth man raised his weapon. The fifth man tried to run. 11 seconds later, All 5 men were on the floor.
None of them were seriously injured. All of them were alive. All of them were conscious. And all of them were looking up at a woman in a charcoal uniform who had not raised her voice once. The dining room was silent. Isabel was on her knees behind the column, mascara streaked, breathing hard, still holding her wine glass. Daniel was standing in the middle of the room, frozen, staring at Amara. Robert Ashworth had not moved from his chair. He had known for 14 months exactly who Amara was. He had helped arrange the job himself, a quiet arrangement made through 3 intermediaries that had given her a place to disappear. Dr. Mwangi stood up slowly. She walked to Amara. She looked at her the way a surgeon looks at a patient who has just walked out of an operating room, alive. "It is you," Dr. Mwangi said quietly. "Isn't it?" Amara looked at her. "It has been a long time, Doctor." "The longest," Dr. Mwangi said. 19 years. The guests looked at one another. The venture capitalist's wife clutched her husband's arm. The retired judge had not blinked in 90 seconds. Isabel, still on her knees, looked up at Amara with an expression no one in the room had ever seen on her face before. What are you?" Isabel whispered. Amara looked down at her. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she spoke, quietly, steadily, in a voice that carried to every corner of the room. "My name is Amara Okonkwo. I was not always a housekeeper. 19 years ago, in a basement apartment in Tunis, I was given a code name. 4 letters. I carried that code name for 11 years. During those 11 years, I kept 4 heads of state alive in 2 different countries. I disarmed 3 armed attackers in corridors without making a sound. I extracted 14 people from situations where hesitation would have meant their death. I ended the lives of 11 men who needed to be ended, in rooms where no one ever found out what had happened. I was, for 11 years, the most effective close protection operative my agency had ever trained. And I was 23 years old when I started." She paused. "I walked away from that life 5 years ago. I made a promise on a rooftop in Casablanca in 2021 that I would never again use my hands for harm. I have kept that promise for 5 years. I poured your wine. I folded your linens. I cleaned your floors. I took every insult you ever gave me, Ms. Laurent, because I had decided that this was the life I wanted instead. A quiet life. A peaceful life. The kind of life where the most dangerous thing I did all day was carry a silver decanter." She looked at Isabel. Then she looked at the 5 men on the floor. Then she looked at the chandelier, the one with the bullet hole in it. "Tonight, that promise ended. Not because I wanted it to, because you forced it to. Because you pushed me, in front of everyone, into a corner where the only choice left was to be who I used to be, or to let everyone in this room die. I chose them. I will always choose them." She turned to Daniel. "Your uncle knew, Mr. Ashworth. He has known since the day he helped arrange for me to be hired here. He arranged it because 21 years ago, I saved his life in a basement safe house in Tunis, and he has been paying me back, quietly, ever since, by giving me a place where I could be invisible." Robert Ashworth, for the first time that evening, spoke. His voice was steady. His eyes were wet. "You were never staff, Amara. You were never help.
You were the most dangerous person in this room, and the only reason any of us are alive right now is because you chose for 5 years not to be." The room did not breathe. And then, slowly, something extraordinary happened. The venture capitalist stood up. He walked to Amara. He bowed, not dramatically, not performatively, but the way one bows to someone who has just saved every life in the room. His wife followed. The retired judge followed. The chef, who had been hiding behind the dessert cart, walked out and stood beside her. The 2 other members of the household staff, who had been crouching under the service table, walked out and stood beside her. One by one, every single person in the room, guests, staff, security, family, walked to where Amara was standing and bowed. Even Isabel. Isabel, on her knees, mascara streaked, dress twisted, looked up at Amara with an expression that was no longer arrogance, no longer cruelty, no longer the polished smile she had worn for years. What was left was something raw, something human, something real. "I'm sorry," Isabel said. The words were small. They were the first honest words she had spoken all evening. "I'm sorry." Amara looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded, once. And then she walked to the staff quarters. She packed a single bag. She walked out the back door of the estate into the salt air of the Boston Harbor night and disappeared, the way she had appeared 5 years before, without telling anyone where she was going. Daniel ran after her. He caught her at the gate. "Where are you going?" he asked. "Somewhere I can keep my promise again," she said. "Can I come?" She looked at him. For the first time all evening, she almost smiled. "Not yet, but maybe someday." She walked into the dark.
The estate was quiet. The guests had gone home. The police had taken the 5 men away. The chandelier had been removed and replaced the next morning. The press had asked questions. Robert had answered none of them. Daniel had issued a single statement. "There was an incident. Everyone is safe. We ask for privacy." The 5 men had been interrogated within 4 hours of being taken into custody. They had given up the name of the former competitor within 2 more hours. The former competitor had been arrested within 8. He had not known who Amara was. He had not known that the agency still protected her, even after she had left. He had not known that the woman who poured the wine at the Ashworth estate had once been the most feared operative in 3 countries. He had not known any of this. He had simply learned, in a federal holding cell in Boston, that some houses are not as unguarded as they appear. Daniel sat alone in the dining room for a long time, and Robert Ashworth, in his study, took out a leather folder he had kept locked for 21 years. Inside was a single photograph. A young woman in Tunis, 2005, standing beside a much younger Robert Ashworth, both of them smiling the way people smile when they have just survived something that should have killed them. On the back, in faded ink, was a single line. Her name was Amara. She saved my life. I will never forget. He set the photograph on his desk. He looked at it for a long time. Then he wrote at the bottom of the page, "Tonight, she saved everyone else's life too." And then she disappeared again, because that is what quiet strength does. It shows up when it is needed. It does what must be done. And then it goes back to being invisible. Not because it is weak, but because it has learned, finally, that the world does not deserve to see it every day. 6 months later, Daniel broke the engagement. Isabel's name appeared in the press for a while. A foundation scandal here, a fraudulent charity there.
the kind of small embarrassments that follow people who live loudly but build nothing. The kind of stories that prove, again and again, that the loudest voice in the room is rarely the one that lasts. Isabel had moved to Paris by the end of the year, and within 18 months she had become a footnote in the same gossip columns she had once graced as a cover story. Amara stayed, for a while. Robert Ashworth passed away 2 years later, and in his will, he left her the small coastal house that had been his first wife's. Not because she had asked, not because anyone had suggested it, because he had written in the letter that came with the deed. She taught my nephew the most important lesson he ever learned, that the people we think we know are usually the people we know the least, and that the people we dismiss are usually the people we should have asked to sit down. I have run operations for 30 years and built an empire from nothing, and I can say with confidence that Amara Okonkwo understands more about real power than any war room I have ever sat in. The last scene of this story happens on a Thursday evening, in the same dining hall, in the same estate, 5 years after that dinner. There are candles, there is wine, there are guests. But the woman pouring the water is not Amara anymore. Amara is sitting at the head of the table, beside Daniel, who is now her husband, who has learned over 5 years to listen before he speaks, who has rebuilt his entire life around the woman who taught him that quiet strength is the only strength that lasts. Daniel had proposed to her on the same balcony in Boston where Robert had once proposed to his first wife, on a cold evening in November, and Amara had said yes only after making him promise 3 things: that he would never raise his voice to her, that he would never dismiss anyone in a uniform again, and that he would tell their children, when they had them, the story of the night a bride learned who the quietest person in the room really was. And the new housekeeper, a young woman from Lagos named Nia, 26 years old, quiet, careful, with a smile that does not quite reach her eyes because she, too, has a past she has not told anyone about yet, is standing in the corner. Nia has her own wooden box. Nia has her own promise. Nia has her own reason to believe that the loudest person in the room is rarely the one worth watching. Amara had hired her not because of her resume, which was thin, written in pencil, with one employer listed, but because Amara had watched her, in the interview, fold a napkin in silence for 4 full minutes, without once looking up to see if she was being judged. Only someone who had learned to be invisible knew how to do that. Only someone who had buried something in a wooden box knew how to fold a napkin that quietly. Amara looks at her. She nods just once. And Nia understands. Some legacies are not taught. They are remembered. They are passed from one quiet woman to the next, across dining tables and kitchen counters and late-night conversations that no one else ever hears. They are passed in single glances that say, "I know who you are. I know what you carried. I know you are going to be okay." They are passed in the choice to stay silent when silence is safer, and in the choice to stand up when standing up is harder. They are passed in the way you fold a napkin, in the way you pour the water, in the way you look at a young woman who has not yet learned that quiet can also be strong. Here's the truth this story leaves you with. The loudest person in any room is rarely the most dangerous one. The most dangerous one is usually the one who has learned, through years of silence, that silence is not weakness. It is the only place where real strength has room to grow. Respect is not something you owe only to people who look like you, sound like you, or stand where you stand. It is something every human being deserves. simply for being human. Simply for showing up to a room and trying, day after day, to do their work without being seen. Simply for being the person everyone walks past without saying good morning. What would you have done if you were at that dinner? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more unforgettable stories. Thank you for watching, and remember, the world is full of quiet Amaras. Treat everyone with the respect they deserve, because you never truly know the strength someone is carrying underneath the surface.